Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the third Mekong Regional Land Forum. We hope you had a good lunch. Now, before we start the next session, we would just like to apologize again for the technical glitches this morning and to our partners who faced difficulties while trying to facilitate the breakout sessions. We are very sorry, and we assure you that we will do our best to make sure all the rooms are ready for the next breakout session. We are also going to attempt simultaneous translation again as well, so please bear with us. And I would also like to remind you again about the poll in case you hadn't cast your vote. You can find the link in the chat box, and please also remember to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. Now, in the first session, we talk about the customary and collective forest tenure in the Mekong region. In this second session, we are going to talk about some of the trends around this issue, not just regionally, but also globally, and how to leverage regional platforms that already exist to find this right balance, delicate but right balance between forest protection and forest rights. Now, to kick off this session, we have Safia Agarwal from the FAO Food. I'm sorry, if you're not speaking, could you please mute the mic? Thank you. Let me start again. Now, to kick off this session, we have Safia Agarwal from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, who's going to be giving us an introduction to the global and regional forest tenure trends. Safia?
Good afternoon, good morning to all participating in this session. My name is Safia Agarwal. I'm a forestry officer with the FAO in Rome. Today, I will begin the session by providing a brief overview on global trends in recognition of collective and customary forest tenure, trends in Asia and the Pacific, and in the Mekong region. Let me do a screen share so you can see my slides. Let's see. I hope you're able to see the screen. Yes? Yes, okay, good. So, as I begin the presentation, I just want to provide a little background and context. So FAO has been working on community-based forestry initiatives around the world for over 50 years. And conducting periodic global reviews as well. So since the 1980s, countries around the world have been increasing recognition of community, collaborative, and smallholder forestry around the world, which at FAO, we have been using the term community-based forestry as an umbrella term for all of these tenure systems. So today, this presentation will focus mainly on community forestry systems, but because the data are mostly aggregated and difficult to segregate, so I will present this slide showing data on both or all of these tenure systems. So today, nearly 1/3 of the forests worldwide are owned or managed by communities and smallholders under formally recognized tenure systems. So and in addition to that, there are many forests which are also customarily managed but not formally recognized by the statutory laws. So the chart here shows the region broken down in global data broken down into 5 regions. And the dark green show the total forest area in those regions. The light green show the areas falling under community-based forest management systems. And for the Asia and the Pacific region, you'll see that 34% of forest area falls under community-based forestry systems of some form, and this is mostly led by China and Australia. And when we look at the figure, actually in practice, the figure should be more closer to 50% when we count all the forest areas that are customarily being managed by communities under informal regimes. And also community forests which are formally recognized by law, but they're not implemented as yet. For example, in Indonesia, in Philippines, part of it, and also in India and other countries as well. So now I will shift my discussion mainly to community forests. When we look at the trends, so since the 1980s, there have been very significant shifts in trends in how and what kinds of rights have been recognized. So in the 1980s, most of the countries were recognizing community forests mainly in policies. The duration was not often specified, or they were short for a few, maybe 2 to 5 years. And communities were mainly allocated degraded forests for subsistence use of non-timber forest products. Today, the situation is very different, and community forests are recognized in laws and even in national constitutions. The duration is often specified and of longer terms, so maybe 15 years or longer. And forests are mainly allocated to good quality forests and intact forests, in addition to some degraded forests, but also communities are provided more commercial rights now to timber and non-timber forest products. When we look at the outcomes, the trends are mixed. Now, there are many reasons for the mixed trends. Until recently, they have not been standardized frameworks used across countries and across sites. So there have been many case studies documenting positive and the not so positive results. But when we look at the meta-analysis being done in the last 5 to 7 years and FAO reviews, global reviews, and in the last 5 years, FAO also has done in-depth reviews or assessments of community-based forestry systems in 23 countries using our newly developed frameworks. So what we are finding are some somewhat consistent, or at least at the national level, trends, and some also very positive trends. So although spatial data are often limited to show increase in forest cover or reduced degradation, but 7 out of the 23 countries had data, and all of those were positive. For example, in Nepal, in Peru, in Bolivia, and so forth. There has been much more evidence of improved governance of forests. So of all the 7 indicators that we used. Now, the reasons for why only 14 rather than not all 23 countries, we'll get into this a little bit later. When we look into the livelihood outcomes, despite the stronger legal provisions, the subsistence benefits, there has been increase in subsistence benefits in 20 of the 23 countries that we did country level, national level analysis, but very few of the countries, so only 10 countries actually, we saw benefits to communities in terms of incomes. So now, this is worth a closer look, like especially when legal provisions are strong, why are communities not able to benefit more? So this slide shows a little bit of the picture on what the challenges are. So even though rights are recognized, many of the countries have not really registered, title, demarcated those rights. So of the 23 countries, for example, that we studied, 13 of the countries had not formalized these rights, and maybe up to only 2 or 3% of the forest, but very little. And 3 of the countries had not even started implementation despite 17 or 18 years of adoption of the laws. So we can see that the mediocre results that we're seeing in some countries are partly because of non-implementation or non-formalization of those rights. When we look at the protections, they were actually weak all across the board, and mostly. So 19 of the 23 countries showed really weak provisions for protections. So in terms of elimination of rights or reduction of rights. And states were also not always respecting rights. So 8 of the 23 countries that we did country analysis, they were basically concessions on top of the community forest areas. So when we look at the regulatory frameworks, most of the countries, so 22 out of the 23 countries with the in-depth analysis, showed major obstacles in the regulatory frameworks in terms of communities benefiting from commercial use of forest products. And in terms, when we look at the benefits provided to communities, they were even fewer. So very few countries, in fact, provided any benefits. So the situation is very unlike concessions and rights granted to other entities. For example, timber companies receive billions of dollars of support annually for various types of support systems, for example, access to good quality forests for production, processing, distribution, and sale of products. Likewise, in the agriculture sector, we see similar support being provided to farmers. So in the forestry sector, this is rather, let's say, the smallhold community forests are really challenged in that sense of not being able to receive any of these kinds of support. So let's take a quick look at the Asia and the Pacific region. There have been mainly three trends observed since the 1970s. So first is the rapid expansion of smallholder forestry, as many of you know, and mainly led by China and Vietnam, but other countries have it as well. Also, recognition of rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, and this has been the trend through the region, but very significantly in the Philippines, Indonesia, India. Nearly 86 million hectares of forests have been allocated towards community forests, but unfortunately, these rights have not been formalized as yet. And then there's increase in collaborative forestry regimes as well. Particularly in Southeast Asia, also South Asia, but the increase in area is fairly modest. So only 3% between the period of 2002 and 2012. Now, let's take a quick look at the Mekong region, which is the most relevant for our discussions for these 2 days. So I think the global picture provides a little bit of a context where we are in the Mekong region. And in the Mekong region, what we're finding is that there are supportive policy and legal frameworks for customary and collective tenure, but there are many, many challenges yet. And one of the biggest challenge is the legal frameworks remain incomplete in most of the countries. So we're talking about countries except China. And the institutional frameworks tend to be weak. Likewise, with implementation is weak. And then there's also conflicts with other sectoral policies, which make it very challenging in terms of implementation. Also, the poor enabling environment for civil society engagement makes the process very difficult. And I think this area needs improvement across the Mekong countries. Also, countries are still allocating largely degraded forests, and commercial access to forest products continues to be very limited and restricted in the laws. So just as an overview again, I would like to conclude with this. The key finding from FAO's experience is that community forestry regimes are a hidden potential. And scaling up of community forestry can contribute significantly to improving forests, to reversing climate change, to strengthening livelihoods, meeting domestic timber and non-timber forest product needs, and delivering on many of the SDGs. And this experience is based on the successes that we are seeing in the handful of countries where the laws have been adopted and implemented well. But in order for success, we need 6 keys in place, as the diagram shows. But all of this starts really from strong tenure regimes in law and in implementation. So let me just end with a couple of resources that are available to countries, states, as well as non-state actors who are interested in assessing existing community-based forestry regimes. community forestry systems or would like to design new ones, or during policy legal reform processes, these frameworks can be very useful. So basically they allow countries to assess the enabling environments for community forestry as well as the outcomes of those. So I will end here, and hopefully we'll have a Q&A session after all the presentations where we can pick up more info. Thank you. Thanks to the organizers, and I'll pass on the floor now.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Safia. And you are right, there are already a lot of questions actually already coming through. So hopefully we can pick some of them up during the Q&A session. But also, you know, it's quite a sobering to hear what you have to say about the challenges and how uneven the implementation in terms of the rights and the legal framework. But thank you also for sort of pointing out how far we have actually come in some areas. Now, for the second speaker, we have Alfie Shakila from the ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry. And she's going to be talking about the experience of the ASEAN-Swiss Partnership on Social Forestry and Climate Change.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. And hello, I hope that my voice is clear.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for having me this afternoon to be in the panel of the Mekong Region Land Forum 2021. I'm Alfie Shakila from ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry, or AWGSF Secretariat. I'm based in Jakarta, Indonesia. So I joined the Secretariat since 2015. And at the time, the name was ASEAN Social Forestry Net, or ASFN. So for you that may familiar to ASFN, and now we become AWGSF. For this afternoon, I will present regarding the experience from the ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry and the ASEAN-Swiss Partnership on Social Forestry and Climate Change, or ASFCC. Next. So, yeah, I would like to explain here that in ASEAN platform, tenure rights, and it's not really addressed in particular a specific topic. So for the social forestry, but social forestry address tenure rights in particular, in focusing, social forestry focuses on that part. Before that, yeah, social forestry in ASEAN actually has various terms, but they refer to the same characteristics, which are engaged community living in and around forests, empower communities, and provide communities with benefit and access to forest resources. So the tenure rights here is important in applying social forestry. So we work in ASEAN in a broad terms, not specific on tenure rights. Next, please. So next, please. Yeah. How is social forestry in ASEAN cooperation? Actually, social forestry is supported the ASEAN cooperation under Food, Agriculture, and Forestry. So, or FAF, food. So the ASEAN social forestry supported the vision on FAF, which are a competitive, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable FAF sector integrated with the global economy based on single market and production base, contributing to food and nutrition security and prosperity in the ASEAN community. So it's very broad here. And then next, please. For the forestry cooperation, so in ASEAN, there are 5 working groups that address forestry sector. So there are working group on forest product development, working group on CITES and wildlife and enforcement, working group on forest management, working group on forest and climate change, and working group on social forestry. All these 5 working groups has a plan of action that already developed every 5 years. So now we are in the current POA for 2021-2025. But from all of these 5 plan of action, it's only working group on social forestry that explicitly mentioned regarding the tenure rights for the community. So next, please. Yeah. So return to the social working group on social forestry in ASEAN. We have several objectives that are presented here, but I only put that relevant in this group. One is recognize and protect customary and statutory tenure arrangement, access and use rights of indigenous people, local communities, forest dwellers, and other forest-dependent communities. Also supporting appropriate legislation, processes, and mechanism, including the principle of FPIC. So we have objective, we have vision, and also we have plan of action. How this mechanism works in ASEAN. So for the AWGSF, next please. So for the AWGSF, as ASEAN is a government-driven organization, so we invite partners as well. Swiss Agency for Development of Cooperation since 2011 supported AWGSF to engage with partners. Here is our partners, C4, RICOF, NTFPEP, ICRAF, and CRCA. So these are the partners that assist the member state to develop, to put social forestry agenda in the respective country as well as at the regional level. So next, please. So it's mentioned that we have AWGSF, and then we have ASEAN Swiss Partnership on Social Forestry and Climate Change, ASFCC, and it's already entered the final phase in February 2020. So what makes ASFCC works in the social forestry agenda in ASEAN? So the program works in the consultative program design aligned with ASEAN documents. So strategic vision, the plan of action is the reference to work with ASEAN. And then the partners also working at the different level. So at the regional level, at the national, and also at subnational. So further, we also have ASFCC also established the effective mechanism to engage with civil society. So the civil society forum meetings held back-to-back with the AWGSF meeting. So what has been discussed during the CSO will be bring to the meeting room with the members, with the ASEAN member state. So it will give the opportunity to greater voice to be heard to forest-dependent people, marginalized, and vulnerable people. So at the national level as well, the partners work with the respective country, having the training courses, country-to-country setting session, in country awareness raising campaigns, and also on-site support to learning sites. So in Cambodia, Laos, PDR, Myanmar, SFCC not only provided the financial, but also facilitates and provided technical support for multi-stakeholders working group at the country level. In the Philippines as well, even the multi-stakeholder process already exists, but the SFCC partners encourage the formalization of a government working group for CDFM. So under this partnership also, we have, we call it ASEAN Strategic Response Fund, or ASLF, that established as the flexible funding mechanism to support country focal point in responding emerging challenges and opportunities to linking social forestry and climate change. And again, social forestry is really close with the tenure. So, led by Rikov and also supported by AWGSF focal points, the ASEAN member state recorded the increasing number of area managed by community forestry in ASEAN. So in 2010, it's around 6 million, but now in the last update in 2019, so it's already more than 13 million. So that's the progress within the ASEAN, and also how at the country level, the partners supported the multi-stakeholders processes. Next, please. So I would like to highlight here some of the documents at the ASEAN level that endorse at the working group and also at the higher level for the working group on social forestry, and then the high level and the senior official of forestry, and then also at the ministerial level. One of the first is the ASEAN guidelines for agroforestry development that led by ICAF. So these particular guidelines actually really put tenure rights into the spotlight under the principle one, create an enabling environment. So security of land tenure, one of the guiding principle for the guidelines, and also led by NTFP-EP. There are two documents: gap analysis of ASEAN standard for NTFP, and just recently ASEAN guidelines for sustainable harvest and resource management protocol for NTFPs. Those two documents also address the tenure rights and also the indigenous people rights. Next, please. So these are two documents that developed RICOF at the regional level. It's a community forestry participatory assessment and agroforestry for climate resilient landscape. Those two also put forest tenure under the recognition of the rights of the land and tenure also become a principle on this. So all of these documents are endorsed by the Working Group on Social Forestry. So if you wish to have all of the documents that I mentioned earlier, you may visit RICOF, one of strong partners of ASFCC. They provide the knowledge tree. That's a repository of ASFCC knowledge product. So next, please. So to moving forward, so AWGSF, as mentioned, that AWGSF continue to work based on the mandate that we have until the final, amidst the final phase. ASFCC already ended in 2020, but the working groups still continue working, and former ASFCC partners committed to support the implementation of Plan of Action in 2021-2025. So I mentioned earlier that I mentioned earlier that the POA already endorsed. So now we have state and outlook of agroforestry in ASEAN as the major deliverable for 2021. So in a couple of weeks, we will have a meeting, and then we hope that this guideline, this state and outlook will be endorsed, which Tenure also put on the spotlight. And under the POA, other divine activities that already agreed by the member state, they are that maybe MRLG may important partners as well, develop ASEAN guidelines for customary tenure recognition and legal guidelines established for FPIC in community forestry. So those two documents are already on the POA. However, we are still seek the guidance from the member state when this document will be the major deliverable for the AWGSF. Yeah, this is the end of my presentation, and thank you, and looking forward for the further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alfie, for telling us about the partnerships work on social forestry in ASEAN. Now, if you're interested in following up on the reports and the knowledge products that Alfie mentioned in her presentation, Recraft has already actually shared the link in the chat box as to where you can find these reports. Our third and final plenary speaker is Femi Pinto from the Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program, or perhaps better known as NTFP-EP, and she's going to be focusing on the importance of creating regional standards.
Hi, good afternoon. I'll just share my screen. So thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone who are here. And I'm actually I'm the executive director of the Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program, and we're both a membership association as well as a network of around over 100 partners in ASEAN and also in South Asia. And within the Mekong, maybe covering 1/3 of that, of partners. And in the Mekong region, we have been working and collaborating with different partner organizations maybe in the last 15 years. And as part of that, we have been also instrumental in the convening and the establishment of the Civil Society Forum on Social Forestry in ASEAN, which is a platform of around 40 civil society organizations, including also indigenous people and local community networks and forest and farm producer organizations in 8 countries, including also the Mekong countries. So today I will be presenting about how we could potentially increase customary and collective forest tenure in the Mekong through a customary forest tenure regional policy framework. And this builds on the partnership and the collaboration examples of that Alfie had presented earlier. I want to maybe start off with additional definitions of forest tenure and customary rights, and so that we can also start to reflect upon them, apart also from what Natalie had already mentioned. So forest tenure is the determination of the status of forest lands, who uses, who manages, who makes decisions about forest resources. And customary rights being a set of community rules and regulations inherited from ancestors and accepted, reinterpreted, and enforced by the community, and which may or may not be recognized officially by the state. So the last part is quite important when we also go forward in looking at customary forest tenure, meaning that it doesn't only have to have formal recognition, but there are also informal pathways, as we had heard also in the earlier discussions. Another terminology that has been mentioned earlier, and which I would be speaking to, is about collective tenure as collective responsibility. And I would like to also share a quote directly from the community about the concept of this. There is no food security without forest and biodiversity, and no biodiversity without people. Indigenous peoples collectively see themselves as the guardians and stewards of forests and biodiversity. They take this role as their eminent responsibility to their ancestors and for future generations. I think this is a very important concept embodied within the concept of customary forest tenure. And there are also these values and these elements that have to be reflected upon in terms of moving forward on how to really realize this in terms of the recognition. So NTFP Exchange Program and the Civil Society Forum on Social Forestry in ASEAN is part of the Regional Alliance on Customary Forest Tenure that is currently also being supported under the Mekong Regional Land Governance. And as an alliance, we have in the next couple of years have an aspiration, an objective, which is that in collaboration with regional platforms in forest, land, and natural resources, that we would be able to promote safeguard mechanisms for the recognition and protection of customary tenure rights for forest-dependent communities, farmers, indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, and women in the Mekong region. And how to do that is to basically navigate around these different complexities, but also try to make use of these partnerships and collaborative platforms in order to advocate for customary rights and for FPIC as two of the outcomes that both the NTFP and Civil Society Forum in partnership with AFA and with AIPP, with the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, that we would be able to support the formulation of the ASEAN guidelines for customary tenure recognition, and that would also support national policies and legislations on the same, and also to support and advocate for community customary forest tenure safeguards, specifically FPIC. As Sophia had already said, and so how to go about this, how to move forward, we start off with just a few reflections on what are the bright spots and some of the contradictions and weak points in forest policy and practice in the Mekong. And some of these have already been mentioned by Sophia and also by Alfie. One of the foremost of this is that as a bright spot, community forestry or social forestry in ASEAN had doubled in the last 10 years. And that would include in the Mekong countries. We've also seen a rise of citizens monitoring and indigenous peoples and local community-led conservation and protection. And we had also started to hear about the bright spots in national laws, including, for example, the National Land Use Policy in Myanmar that was adopted in January 2016, which includes already provisions for recognizing customary tenure, and thus indicating also constructive development in the acknowledgement of such rights. Although it is on hold, the operationalization of that is currently on hold. I think that in itself, that adoption in 2016 is already a bright spot. And there is also that the drafting of the national land law, though that the progress of that is also slowed down. There's also both the forestry and land laws in Lao PDR that has also been adopted. And then I had heard also earlier in the breakout session that there's actually already been an assessment of how it's been going for both the forestry and land law. So there's also some good recommendations coming out of that. In Vietnam, Hong earlier in session 1 had also mentioned about this, about the forestry law that was adopted in 2017. And one of the most important points there is the recognition of community rights to land and forest resources and them as official forest owners. And lastly, one of the brightest spots that we also see is the voluntary and self-mobilization of indigenous community and locally conserved areas. These are non-formal actions, but already there's a number of documentation and mapping that's also been going on, specifically by communities and forest peoples on determining and setting also some documentation about their traditionally and indigenous and locally conserved areas, or ICCAs. Now next is the reflection of what the contradictions and weak points have been in forest policy and practice in the Mekong. And we've also heard about that, started to hear about that in session 1. And Sophia had also already gave us some very good points around this. Some of which are that, for example, in Laos, while there has been some national laws already in place, they have, in the assessment, they have also found that there's still some weak points and some lack of clarity in terms of how to, the pathways to formalize customary rights. And then there's also some weak recognition of customary forest management systems and practices. For example, in terms of still some investments coming in within customary forest areas, despite perhaps already some form of recognition for the community rights of communities. So there's that contradiction. So how do we resolve these? Again, related to this, the expansion of agribusiness and other development projects, plantations, etc. This is happening, and that's also being pointed out as also a factor wherein high and fast deforestation rates are continuing to happen, despite, for example, despite us recognizing and knowing that customary forest tenure would actually be able to serve as a frontline safeguard for deforestation and forest land alienation. So this contradiction is actually being seen right on the ground. And we've also heard that there's still, as yet, despite these positive things that are happening, there's still a recognized untapped potential in terms of sustainable use and management of forest, and its resources, economic benefits seem not to still be trickling down and being enjoyed by communities fully. And there's competition and conflict over land use. And as I said, economic benefits are not fully enjoyed over the natural resources. So how then, with that situation happening, so the next couple of slides is just kind of a positive spin towards really seeing how we can move along the process based on the learnings and the positive things that we have seen in terms of regional processes facilitating certain policy, acting as a policy support, and that would also serve as some guidance and also support for national policies and legislations. And that is to move a process towards a regional customary forest tenure policy framework. So through the MRLG, we are hoping that we could contribute to this in the next couple of years, maybe as a starting point, or maybe we'd be able to see it through. But adapting and learning from the multi-stakeholder processes before it that has happened already in the ASEAN, and we have seen, and we will also be able to hear some presentations about them. The examples are ASEAN agroforestry guidelines, responsible agricultural investments, the guidelines on agricultural cooperatives, etc. In this process, we think that this would also help facilitate a deeper and common understanding about customary forest tenure, elaborate on the definitions, rally also the definitions straight from the ground by the communities, and work through, with this process, you work through the contradictions and the concept translations and political nuances, and also work through some resource limitations along the way. Within this framework, what could include, which is also kind of a sample that we are also picking up from previous frameworks that have been adopted. So that would include, perhaps in this case, the definition of customary forest tenure, look into safeguards, include the process, rights, and responsibilities. The next 3 points on traditional livelihoods and food systems, traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge systems and practices and governance systems are really crucial to elaborating on this and digging deep into the concept and the actual situation and practice around these traditional livelihoods and food systems. For example, one of the weak spots and contradictions currently is that there's some exclusions in terms of the giving of the rights under community forest rights. For example, exclusions in granting the practice, allowing the continued practice of rotational agroforestry systems. And yet this is one of the traditional, found to be also sustainable natural resource management system practiced for food security and livelihoods by indigenous peoples and local communities. Lastly, such a framework could include guidelines on those guidelines and principles on those 5 elements, particularly also looking into the process on how to respect, protect, and fulfill these, and then the roles and responsibilities, and also an aspect related to resolving and mediating conflict. Lastly, why is this important? Basically, it's not something new. There's already a precedent of it being seen as a positive process, and it would also be quite complementary to international standards that exist and where our countries already have signed on to. It would also reflect the fulfillment and respect of the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. It would include, and within that already include and encompass certain safeguards like FPIC. It would be consistent with some of the other international standards, and even though they're voluntary, but they're also widely now being adopted and used as framework, and also using that for the plans, including voluntary guidelines and governance of tenure, on the RAI, responsible agriculture investments, the sustainable development goals, and within our region, it's also already contained within the strategic plan of action on food, agriculture, and forestry. Lastly, it will, all these different things enriching and complementing the bright spots in policy and practice, contribute to commitments around enhancing climate change mitigation and adaptation contributions, building up the economic benefits of forest policy, including social forestry, and then also looking into enhancing biodiversity conservation and protection efforts. It will not only be a framework to enhance regional cooperation, but definitely will also support national policy processes, and it will facilitate the constructive participation of indigenous peoples and local communities, and platforms like the Civil Society Forum can also be positively contributing to facilitating the distillation of experiences, lessons learned, cases, evidence, and recommendations. We will be talking more about this, and hope we invite you to join us in the breakout on critical elements in customary tenure, and on regional policy frameworks in ASEAN's forested landscape. Sorry about the spelling. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Femi, for your presentation, particularly, giving us an overview on some of the bright spots as well as the weak points. Let's now move on to the panel discussion and Q&A, which is going to be moderated by Natalie from MRLG. I'm sure all of you will remember her from her session this morning, from the first session. Now, Natalie will be joined by David Gantz from RECOFT, Doris Capistrano, who is the Senior Advisor of ASEAN-Swiss Partnership on Social Forestry and Climate Change that we just heard about earlier from Alfie, and Nonette Royo from the International Land Tenure Facility.
Thanks, Nonette. So I wanted to thank all of our presenters here today. I think we have an incredible wealth of knowledge here, and we were lucky to be able to hear a progression going from Safia, who really talked us through community forestry and recognition of collective forest tenure rights, including updates, but also inspirations and food for thought. It was clear from Safia that while there has been some progress to formalize these tenure rights, there still remains a lot of work ahead of us, but there are opportunities to engage. Alfie shared some very interesting work that the ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry is doing, and what it has done in the past with the ASEAN-Swiss Partnership on Forestry and Climate Change. She really shared how regional partners, platforms like the ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry and participatory guidelines can serve as a space to leverage more inclusive policies. And lastly, Femi, we were very lucky to have Femi, who talked us through, did a bit of a synthesis of both of the presentations in the morning and gave us inspiration in terms of looking at what it means to create something like a regional standards for customary tenure, given that these systems are incredibly diverse, giving us a good terminology such as bright spots in policy, which is a nice way to think of it. It's a positive way, but it also brings us back to communities and this sort of circular vision that we support here. So I would like to start with Doris, and what we would like to hear from you are, what are your views about the best ways to leverage high-level platforms to increase the recognition of customary and community tenure? In your opinion, how can these platforms have traction at a national level? And in your work and in your experience, what are the most effective pathways and methods to formalize tenure? And what will this look like in the future? So I will pass the mic to Doris. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Natalie, and good afternoon to everybody. And thanks also for the very enriching presentations from our three presenters. I think the presentations in many ways already touch on the answers to your questions, Natalie. And I think in terms of ASEAN, we are in Southeast Asia. This is probably an unusual region where we have established long-running political platform that operates by consensus and has political, mandate, has political power. So it is, they agree on priorities and agree on strategies by consensus. And therefore, their norm-setting role is really quite important and perhaps may not be available in all regions to the same effect. However, the final action really rests with member states. So while the guidelines are very important, they are key to focusing on what the consensus thinking is on the key principles, the key factors that need to be addressed, and those that could be pursued. And in a way also a signaling of what might be politically possible to push. So norm setting is very important, but it's very important also to make sure that there is action at the national level, because at the end of the day, implementation, action, decision, institution building really has to occur at the national level. And so the example of ASFCC, the ASEAN-Swiss Partnership Program, I think highlights key elements of institutional design or program design that have been critical and proven repeatedly to be necessary. One is the need to really work at multiple scales or multiple levels, multiple institutional levels, in this case at the regional level, and also within sub-regions like in Mekong as opposed to the 10 ASEAN member states, and within countries, sub-territories or sub-juris, depending on and at the end of the day, for issues like customary tenure, they have to be localized because that's really where, there's no one size fits all. So multiple levels. The other issue I think that is part of a successful design in my view is that these tend to be targeted to institutions with the mandate to deal with tenure issues or issues that are closely related and impinging on customary tenure. It's a vast landscape, but focusing concerted, consistent, mutual reinforcing, complementary efforts would be critically important. But not just institutions with the mandates, but within those institutions, ensuring that there are individuals or groups within these mandated institutions that are strategically positioned to actually push the agenda. Because otherwise it could soak up so much time and energy trying to cultivate institutions, which in the end really would not lead you anywhere because there are no champions, but having identified from a strategic analytical, triaging of where the best investments are, ensuring that these mandated institutions with key individuals, particularly who are projected and expected to move up the ranks and eventually, hopefully, have leadership positions in these institutions, are provided with the resources that they need. And key resources would include one, analytical information developed in a timely manner that would be used for immediate decision making. In other words, the sequencing, the structuring, the timing of analytical information presented at the right level, and also provided with enough concrete, actionable recommendations, really could get you faster than if you were just to provide information writ large. So for example, research needs to be targeted to particular issues for which there is an appetite for action, or for which member states need to deliver or meet international commitments. So I think when we think about how to progress on tenure, it really needs to be very strategic. The example of ASFN, for example, is important because from a network, a learning platform, it then became a working group with a political mandate and a technical mandate. But the history of having worked together with different stakeholders made a lot of difference. So that for the first few years, nothing happened. And then, as was mentioned, suddenly, an expansion of I just heard the presentation from Vietnam. They're thinking into 2050 and how all of this, and I'm delighted to see Mr. Tuyan, who was one of the focal points in his earlier. So capacity building, I think, is critically important in that regard. For the future, I think there will be limits to working within sectors. And therefore, you might be able to push forestry customary tenure recognition within the forestry sector, but very quickly you will learn that you bump into the agricultural or investment or mining sectors as well. And this is more powerful than forestry. And therefore, I think the strategy that works in forestry will have then to be, the process will have to be used for other sectors as well to widen the base. Key to this is the role of civil society and civil society organizations that are able to and need to enrich the thinking within governments and support institutions and their technical support, I think, are critical. So I leave it at that, but I think these are key elements for the future. And framing it within contemporary issues, food security, inequality, climate, building back better, I think for the future would be critical. And finally, expect pushback and reversals. And there is no one pathway. You just have to be opportunistic and flexible so that when the door opens, you're ready with your networks and your alliances. Thank you, Natalie. I think my time is up.
Much, Doris. Can you just checking if you can hear me? Yes, okay. Yeah, thanks very much, Doris. That we are definitely have a lot of food for thought from your reflections, and I think it's really valuable to have you, all three of you on the panel, because of your extreme and extensive history of working on these issues, and the ability of hindsight is extremely valuable here, particularly thinking about key issues such as champions, forward-looking champions, but also looking beyond and being agile, and this ability to be resilient and adapt, which is all also mirrored in customary tenure systems. So with that, I will move on to Nonette. And Nonette, I'd like to ask you the same questions. So again, best ways to leverage high-level platforms to increase customary tenure or community forest tenure. How will these platforms have traction at a national level? And in your experience, what are the most effective pathways and methods to formalize tenure, and what will this look like in the future? I think we're very lucky to hear from you, Nonette, and hear about the experience of the tenure facility. So please.
Thank you, Natalie. And I'm very, very happy to be here with a lot of people that are coming from the region, Southeast Asia. So good afternoon and good morning to the people around where I am from, here in Stockholm, the tenure facility. So the key words probably for the 5 minutes that I have, and I hope less so that I can share some with David, is one, these international platforms come with money. So follow the money. It is very important that we understand that everything that has changed and shifted at the level, at the global level, is because of consistent efforts of communicating what the ground has done. Thank you so much, Safia, also Femi. But would the presentation show exactly where subsidiarity works? Yeah, it's really important. even just at the level of looking at the impacts on increased forest cover, improved forest governance. It is amazing. So now why is it that benefits are still low? Follow the money, look for what kind of rewards is available already. And this is where it's really important for us that Indigenous peoples have been teaching us and telling us repeatedly and consistently that you come in with 4 things. Respect existing practices. Subsidiarity means understanding what already is working, regardless of formal recognition. And connect with those people. They are not just individuals or families, they're clusters, communities, and peoples. And they have, despite everything they have been going through, they have been continuing to do their work. So connect with them. The third is reflect what are the instruments that didn't work. And this is really good. It's Safia and again, Femi, you've kind of, and who's the other? Alfie. Yes, you've been collecting and really looking at what works, what doesn't work, what the details are amazing, important, useful, right? So then reflect what can work, what cannot, what does not add burden, and what can enhance, and act on those because it's urgent. Our life support system relies on the last set of partners that we have been ignoring and not funding. So the Tenure facility is an attempt to try to do this. And it is really important that we realize we're not alone, we're just trying. We're putting larger amounts of money to where the communities are doing this work, measuring their boundaries. They've been doing this also before, so other donors can take credit for all the things that we had succeeded in doing, because this is a continuing process. It started maybe how many years ago? We know we're getting older. We saw each other several years back, and it still is happening, and it will continue to happen. But if we hold hands and connect these links, we can support. And I like the progress, amazing, Safia, on what was recognized before and what's recognized now. Now it comes to implementation, right? Respect, regulation, but that's not linear. We have to start putting together pieces, and there are pieces. It can be done, and there will be challenges like what Doris reminded us, but we go through that. So for the Tenure facility alone, we have now, for example, Asia, Latin America, and Africa combined in process, total recognitions 4.4 million hectares already. Combined in process, 9.8 million hectares. In total, that's 14.2 in the last 5 years. But, compared to what all of you have done, that's just a drop in the bucket. Yeah, we have to do a lot more things. And tenure is what I've said there in the Tenure facility. That's not enough. We have to support continually those processes, link them to where the money is, and then follow the international frameworks. They offer money. Yeah, it's not very easy, but that's really what's important is they have standards. Yes, a big all standards. 5 minutes is off. So let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nonette. Yes, 5 minutes. I know it's very short. But exactly, I think something that really comes out here of what you were sharing with us is what has worked on the ground for communities, connect with those people and utilize those strategies and scale up those strategies. And that's what the Tenure facility is doing. But also follow the money, see where things are being funded, and find a way to support local communities with creative ways to find access to those funding, to those funds, and find a way to directly fund those communities in partnership with different governments. And again, I think something that's similarly comes out from what Doris said is the need to be flexible in this space. So on that note, I will hand the mic over to David to also hear some of your reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up? Yes? Okay, good. Thank you for inviting RECOF to this very important forum. Obviously, we are part of the Alliance, but I also want to say it's really important to have this kind of forum to create the space to discuss these very, very important issues. And I want to thank Safia, Femi, and Alfie for setting the stage on what is, you know, the main issues that we need to address here in the region, the Mekong region, but also the ASEAN region, and I would say the larger Asia Pacific region, even as we start to look at some of the trends that Safia presented, those are also including China, Australia, and the Pacific. So if you're not familiar with RECOF, we've been working on these issues for a long time with communities, with NGOs on community forestry for 30 plus years. And we're really proud to be a part with all the other ASFCC partners here on the positive trend that Safia shared on social forestry and on, if you will, the tenure reforms and the laws and processes that are in place. You know, one of the things reflecting on ASFCC and what Doris has said and what Nanette has said, you know, you really need to have people on the ground. And this was something RECOF made a decision a while ago to set up national offices and to have, you know, 7 country offices. I know FEMI and TFPP also has this approach. You know, you have these scalable approaches, a regional approach to advocate and to put pressure on socioeconomic platforms like ASEAN, but then you also have national level interventions that are really important to connect the policy to practice, exactly what Alfie and Femi, you know, highlighted in their presentations. And this was really an important part of the ASFCC project, and I want to commend the Swiss, who are also funding MRLG, on the long-term approach. And you know, you'll see the publications that are on the knowledge tree that was mentioned by Alfie. That's the combined effort of all of these institutions supporting ASEAN. And we will be launching later this week the newest publication under the ASFCC project, even though it's ended, on tenure and social forestry in the ASEAN member states. And that will be a very important kind of flagship document to look at tenure reforms that have taken place and also where we need to go from here. Platforms are only as good as their ability to reach out to people. So, you know, these tools that are out there, these guidelines, these best practices documents are all out there. They're on the Social Forestry Working Group platform. They're on the knowledge tree platform, but it's really up to you as counterparts, as beneficiaries, to use them and to understand what they're there for. We've been working on these issues for decades. As Nanette said, you know, we're the gray-haired colleagues in the room trying to inspire you all. But these platforms are very, very effective if they have this long-term approach. And Doris said it very eloquently. There will be shocks to the system. There will be some setbacks. There will be some targeting of defenders of human rights defenders or environmental defenders or even climate change advocates. We certainly had that for the last 4 or 5 years. But we have to weather the storm. Excuse the expression there, but we really do need to weather the storm, whether it's a military coup in Myanmar or some setbacks in one or more of the Mekong countries. And there's no one pathway that's going to work for every country in every situation. I think we heard that from Safia's presentation. But if the right stakeholders are at the table, we have things like the NGO forum that NTFPEP has facilitated for years. We have to be able to discuss and strategize the way forward to formalize tenure, and then it has a higher chance of working. Also very, very important, it's not just about legitimizing the tenure arrangements, but getting to where the benefits are really felt at the ground level. So if it is carbon, if it is water in the case of PFAS, we have to make sure that the benefits are being shared equitably, that they're being shared fairly, that they adhere to FPIC principles, that ultimately they take an HRBA approach to the governance systems that are being built around these benefit sharing mechanisms. So we know firsthand that this is a very hard process. It takes a long time, but we have to ultimately be patient and see that it will come through. I was asked to kind of close out by asking a question to one of our panelists. I want to commend all the panelists, so I'm not only just thanking Alfie for this question that goes to her, but I want to thank all the panelists. And to think about this, there's a lot of imbalances still in this region between men and women, between local communities and authorities. There's even imbalances between institutions. And a lot of these imbalances or power differentials are institutionalized. And since we have regional platforms like the ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry that help to bridge, if you will, between some of these players, a multi-stakeholder platform, how do we translate this policy into practice? And for Alfie, what is the way that you've seen in the ASEAN Working Group right-size the power dynamic to improve social forestry? We heard about the doubling of hectares under social forestry in the ASEAN member states. What is the one way you've seen within the working group system to kind of level the playing field of these power dynamics? Thank you again for having me.
Great, thank you very much, David. Thanks for those words, and I think it's very important to understand the existing platforms and the existing initiatives and the existing organizations that have worked on this, but also looking at how those partnerships will be developed and fostered in the future. It was a great question. So why don't we have Alfie answer the question? But Alfie, because we're still a little bit short on time, if you could be succinct with your question, we'll be able to ask a few other questions to the other presenters as well. Thank you all of the discussants for your inspiring and very knowledgeable words. Alfie, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. There's a prior call now, so it's a bit, sorry for the noise in the background. Yeah, it's a tough question, actually. I'm not sure that I may able to address, but I must say that let's be positive, because we know that sometimes working with the institution, especially with the ASEAN, sometimes it's very slow. But if you say that, okay, it's double, but then what next? And then, so actually the progress is there, although it seems like it takes so many years, but actually what happened in the recent years, the number is just added recently. So it means that what we have been done in so many years, it started to show the result. And yeah, I agree that it's a long process, but meanwhile that please stay positive. And then as I say that I've been in this group since 2015, and I see the positive attitude towards the social forestry, and also the recognition of the multi-stakeholders process, including recognize the tenure rights. So I think that's can I respond on this. Thank you. You're still mute.
Yeah, I think now it's okay. Thank you. I will ask a question now to Safia. This is coming from the Land Court Group in Myanmar. The question is, how can community forestry programs effectively cover customary tenure systems?
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. I've been trying to respond to some of the questions on chat while we're having the session. So this is a very important question, because what we are finding, I think what we are realizing over time, and especially with the voluntary guidelines on governance of tenure, that the best option really is to recognize customary tenure generally on land, forest, fisheries. And this is what has been recommended and endorsed by countries. And that's the approach I think that FAO and others are recommending. But customary tenure recognition is not so simple, because there's a lot of political will needed and so forth. But community forests have been used as a vehicle to recognize customary tenure in forested areas, and this has worked in some cases, others not. So in some cases, governments, the forestry laws recognize community forestry, but they're not based on any form of customary usage. And this can cause conflict between communities at the local level when one community tries to lay claim on a community forest which others have been using. So really, I think the best option is to build on customary tenures that are already recognized and accepted socially at the local level. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Thank you, Safia. I will move on to Femi. While there have been a lot of questions in the chat, and as some of you might have seen, I spilt water on my computer, so I'm borrowing a computer, so excuse me for some confusion. I think one interesting question that came from a colleague in Ideas asks, Femi, you mentioned ICCAs in your presentation. Can you explain a little bit to the group here how ICCAs and looking more at tenure in terms of ancestral domain management might apply in the region, and potentially how that could be incorporated in something like guidelines or these handbooks on FPIC? Thank you.
Thank you to Ideas. Thank you, Natalie, for that question. Actually, as we see it, ICCAs have not figured as yet in forest policy, but when it comes to customary forest tenure, the notion and the concept and the actual tangible geographically bounded territories of life, indigenous community and locally conserved areas are there, and these are examples already of how customary systems, practices, indigenous knowledge systems and practices can already be reflected. So I think it's quite important. In some of the countries in ASEAN, this is already much more progressing than in the Mekong, but in the Mekong region, it's also already picking up. It's a form of self-mobilization and self-organizing of what people themselves feel is the bounds, are the bounds of their customary practice, their use, and the link that they have with their land, with their forest, with their waters, etc. So this is one probably window to start talking and deep diving into the notions of customary tenure.
Thank you very much, Femi, and thank you thanks all of you for your questions and for your comments. As Tin mentioned earlier, we'll be sharing these and also sharing some responses that presenters weren't able to get to during the session. I think there have been a lot of really wonderful, very insightful comments, difficult to summarize, but I think the main key message from here is look at what communities are doing, mirror that, take opportunities and act on opportunities where there is existing progress, support communities in terms of advocating for their rights, and continue, regardless of potential shocks or rollbacks, to go ahead and find alternative, innovative solutions to formally recognize tenure rights. I'll hand the mic over to Tin for the closing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and of course, to the speakers as well. We're now going to have another short break, which will be followed by more breakout group discussions like this morning. Again, let me re-emphasize that these sessions will be under different Zoom links. You can find the links in the Huova app or on the webpage of the event on the Land Portal website. Now, these breakout sessions will start at 3:45. Like this morning, there are 10 groups that will be looking at initiatives at country as well as regional levels and how to increase forest tenure recognition in both policy and practice. Some of the sessions are in local languages, but all sessions have English translation. Now, the breakout sessions will last about 45 minutes, after which you'll have another short break before rejoining the plenary for key takeaways, which will be at 4:45. So please be back in the plenary by that. Let me just repeat just the timings again. The breakout sessions will start at 3:45, and then the plenary will start at 4:45. See you again soon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the plenary session. And I hope you had a great discussion during the breakout sessions. We now have Robin Osterbeek from RECOFT, who will be sharing with us the key takeaways and plans for further actions for the second session. Robin?
Hi, Tin. Actually, it's me, Julian Atkinson, who will be sharing the key takeaways.
Oh, I do apologize. Julian Atkinson will be sharing the key takeaways for the session. Please introduce yourself, Julian. I do apologize.
That's not a problem at all. Thank you very much. My name is Julian Atkinson. For those of you who do not know me, I manage program coordination and technical services at RECOFT at our main office in Bangkok, Thailand. Please give me a minute so that I may share my screen. Oops. 1 second. Sorry about that, 1 second. All right, are you all able to see? Please give a thumbs up.
Yes, we do.
All right, thanks again. Okay, thank you very much for joining us on the first day of the third Mekong Regional Land Forum. Today, our conversations focused on how we can advance the recognition of customary tenure rights and collective forest tenure in the region. I would like to share some of the key ideas and main takeaways that stood out to me. With the wealth of the discussion that we've had today, I must admit, it's not an easy task. During the plenaries and breakout groups, we learned about the diversity of customary forest tenure systems that have been practiced for generations by indigenous peoples and local communities throughout the Mekong region. We also learned about the different experiences and pathways being employed to document these systems so that they can be better recognized in order to improve local tenure security. The recording and documentation of customary tenure rights and practices is an essential step. But how can we then ensure that these are subsequently recognized and respected by external actors, such as other communities, government authorities, and the private sector, and also appropriately enshrined within statutory legal frameworks? It has been heartening to see that some significant progress has been made in the forest sector within our region. Over the last 5 years, we have seen in all Mekong countries the enactment of new policy instruments, the creation of new multi-stakeholder mechanisms and partnerships, and an increasing recognition of the value that local communities and civil society can contribute in forest governance. The area of land recognized under various community-based management modalities has increased, and social forestry is slowly gaining wider acceptance as a viable, cost-effective approach in climate change adaptation and mitigation, forest landscape restoration, rural livelihoods development, sustainable forest trade, and disaster risk reduction. These bright spots, as coined by Femi, have provided an increasing number of opportunities for local people to understand, claim, exercise, and defend their rights over local forest land and resources, as evidenced by the multitude of examples that we've shared today. But these examples also point to a number of key barriers and challenges that continue to inhibit communities from realizing a full spectrum of rights over their customary land. What are these immediate key barriers, and how can we tackle them to turn the promise of new and emerging policy openings into successful practice? A recurrent message that I've heard today is that while countries have had success in passing new laws and legal instruments for forest tenure reform, it remains much more difficult to successfully implement these at scale. While it takes time to attune the mindsets of key actors, develop their capacities, and mobilize networks of human and financial resources to new legislation, this is not the only reason. In many cases, the recognition of rights continues to remain partial, meaning that many legal frameworks don't recognize the full bundle of rights. They sometimes don't recognize the whole area of land where communities have been exercising their customary rights. They don't account for the full socio-ecological relationships that communities have with their forests and land. And they can also perpetuate some existing inequalities within communities. Income benefits also continue to be limited due to inadequate commercial rights and regulatory barriers that restrict market access. Our discussions today also show that many policies and procedures continue to be onerous to implement and place an unfair burden of responsibility on local communities. There remain significant imbalances of power between different actors. Women and other marginalized groups also continue to be significantly disadvantaged when it comes to recognizing their knowledge, needs, interests, and rights over forest spaces and resources. Therefore, a lot of work remains to be done in order to level the playing field, in particular to translate higher level policy law and laws into tools and processes that are accessible and implementable by rights holders on the ground, and also to ensure that there is equity in space for women and marginalized members from the communities to participate and make decisions that have a meaningful effect on their lives. A lot of this will require more learning and sharing with one another, both within and across Mekong countries. This is where communities of practice and mechanisms like this very forum can play an important role. Within the Mekong countries, we've seen evidence of how civil society networks and multi-stakeholder working groups can work to effectively coordinate efforts in tenure reform. The ASEAN Working Group on Social Forestry, the CSO Forum, and other regional platforms provide opportunities to share learning regionally, as well as to produce and adopt guidelines and protocols in line with international instruments, and also offer ways to follow the money, as Nonette said. The collaborative efforts being taken to develop an ASEAN regional policy framework for recognizing customary forest tenure holds great promise, but we must ensure that this remains practical and inclusive, and that the process engages the right key champions who are strategically positioned within ASEAN member states to push the agenda forward. Tomorrow afternoon session on the application of the existing ASEAN guidelines for responsible agricultural investment may present some useful lessons in this regard. One final point. In many Mekong countries, we are still grappling with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Looking ahead, there's a lot of talk among us in the development community about building back better towards a green recovery. On the other hand, governments may continue to see foreign direct investment as the best way to kickstart national economies. FLEGT and REDD+ continue to also be important entry points driving forestry reform in all Mekong countries. And inevitably, there will also be other unforeseen setbacks and rollbacks, as Doris and David noted during their panel. In all these cases, we must continue to push for strong and clear rights for Indigenous peoples and local communities to make sure that these are at the top of the agenda. And we must all work together to ensure that adequate attention and resources are invested and appropriately channeled to address customary rights as a capstone issue. Tomorrow, we will shift our discussions to focus on a key determining influence over how local tenure security is played out within Mekong countries. That is, how to manage and respond to patterns and practices of investment in Mekong forest landscapes. The morning session is aimed at demystifying the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. These principles are designed to protect the rights of communities to land and resources while also protecting investments by avoiding land conflicts. The afternoon session will highlight the potential effectiveness of tools such as the ASEAN Guidelines for Responsible Agricultural Investment in steering agribusiness investments in Mekong forest landscapes towards a more sustainable future. From what we have learned today, I hope we can enter tomorrow's discussion with a deepened appreciation of how the recognition of customary forest tenure remains an essential building block for FPIC and responsible investment practices in the Mekong. So there you have it. I've had my say. I encourage you to have yours. Please remember to take part in the poll today at www.menti.com. I believe the poll closes at the end of the session, so please enter your answers in for the question, what are the priorities for protecting customary forest tenure in the region? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Julian, for capturing the essence of, what was essentially very broad and comprehensive presentations and discussions that took place during session 2, and also talking about what's in store tomorrow. Now, we've come to the end of day 1 of this forum. I hope it has been both enriching and energizing, technical glitches notwithstanding, and we look forward to welcoming you again tomorrow. Like Julian said, we're going to take a deep dive into the issues around FPIC and responsible agricultural investment tomorrow. Now, in the meantime, please continue having discussions and give inputs using the Huova app's messaging and community boards. Thank you so much for joining us and for your patience this morning, and see you tomorrow. Have a good evening.